I'm Teresa Caraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm going to be responding to Russell Brand's interview of Dr. Luke Kemp called Emergency Powers. I'm going to respond to four things that I agree heartily with Luke. I'm going to delve deeper into two examples that he gives from history. I'll respond to two different areas that Russell talks about, and I'll end by describing why I think this could bode well and that we may be at the tipping point of a 100-generation trajectory. So let's get started. Luke talks about how he believes that what's happening now with emergency powers is not a bug but a feature. Everything has been leading towards that. The system is working exactly the way that it should. In another YouTube video that Russell made, he talks about Elon Musk and his space phallic vehicle, which he calls the spacey cock rocket. I think that that's an apt metaphor for the system that we've been living under for 100 generations, which serves the ejaculations of men with children as an inconvenient byproduct. I think what we need to be moving towards is a feminine economy that serves the interest of children with the ejaculations of men as a momentary contribution. So that's where I would like to look at this shift going, that being in a point of crisis that has the cumulative efforts of all the direction that has gone before of capitalism, this is the moment in which change is possible. Another area that I agree with Luke completely is when he talks about how both the left and the right just have different forms of authoritarianism that they are now fond of. That my friend Michael Olson, who does Food Chain Radio, says that the left is against big business and the right is against big government, and I'm against both of those. I add, and also big banks, which is the mother of them all. So when we look at that authoritarianism, Luke talks about how the left has become puritanical and vilifies the white working class. I have two episodes that talk about that. One is Appalachian Rage, and the other is the liberal hate speech and local media, in an example that I found really disturbing of how that's become mainstreamed now. So I think he's right that it's not just vilification, but ridicule that the left is engaging in a way that I think needs further examination as to why we have this divide. There's a recent episode that is talking about how the left tends to be more inclusive of outsiders and that the right typically is against them. I think that could be because the left tend to be professionals and academics, and no immigrant is going to be able to challenge their jobs because it takes so much money in order to be able to achieve that. Whereas the right or the white working class are doing more manual labor or real work, as I call it. And so in that case, you have a direct challenge. So we have a system in which capitalism wreaks havoc and then expects the state and the people to clean up their mess at their own expense. That's what we need to challenge, not decide who is more egalitarian about spending other people's money. So now let's I want to look at four things that were a revelation to me that Luke talked about. He mentions a sociology text and how it talks about four sources of power: ideological, economic, military, and political. Let's go back to what I'm talking about with a feminine economy and how I believe the feminine has not existed in our culture in any form of power for the last 100 generations. In my episode, The Divine Feminine, Woman as Archetype on Jordan Peterson, I talk about how there is no representation of the female in our concept of divinity, in the Trinity, in any of our theologies. Women don't exist. And so that drives the idea that women are less than men economically, that in our economies are designed in order to make the rich richer. They serve hierarchy. And as Luke says, all hierarchies tend to that same power dynamic. They always tend, and of course I point out that hierarchy is the inheritance order of the archons, and the archons were the rulers in ancient Greece. So we look at that pyramid, and the competition to move up the pyramid is the masculine form of economy that we have now. And if we look at the accumulation of wealth, that does make it the shape of that cockrocket pyramid that we talk about that Russell talks about with Elon Musk. And if we look at the feminine as the archetype representing home, family, and community, we're looking at a cooperative model that could be represented by the circle. Or if we wanted to be corny, it could be represented by the heart. So in those cases, we also have a military that serves aggressive power, that is something that is invading, occupying, penetrating into other people's countries. We don't have a military that's feminine, which it could be. It could be for self-defense, defense of the home and the hearth. And then if we look at the final of political, the way our political system is designed is competitive. It is pitting one side against the other and not doing what would be a cooperative, sovereign concept of deciding what it is that we want to have as our own policies. So now I want to look at a couple examples that Luke gives from history that I think deserve more examination, just because we know that history is written by the winners. And in this case, the winners are always the powers that are now in charge that have tricked us to this place. And I think history is a way in which they've done it. In my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, I talk extensively about Greek democracy and how that was formed. I look at it as a trick, that it was when slaves and the landless and the colonized were in rebellion with the small landowners against the archons, against the Areopolis in Greece. And what they were demanding was control of the resources. Instead, what was put in by Solon, who was the one who negotiated this, was stepping stones so that small landowners could become part of the assembly by supporting the military. If they had enough wealth to be able to support the military, they could move up that ladder. So when Luke talks about Greek democracy as an example of when there was progress and citizen participation without the use of violence, I think that was not something that was inclusive, that was something that actually made it so that other people, including women, had no place in the assembly, and that it created that hierarchy, but did not actually make a leveling of the playing field the way that he talks about. And he mentions to be able to participate by lottery. I would suspect that was only for members of the assembly, and that wasn't something that women or the colonized or slaves or the landless could be part of. Another example that Luke gives of a time that there was despotic creep, that emergency powers ended up becoming permanent, is the Weimar Republic. Now, a book that I quote extensively in my book is Web of Debt by Ellen Brown. If you were to read one book other than mine, of course, this should be the one to read. In it, she talks about Germany after World War I and how the Treaty of Versailles made Germany responsible for paying the war debts, the war expenses of all other countries. And that was equal to 3 times the value of all property within Germany. The Weimar Republic is seen as the ultimate example of hyperinflation and why states shouldn't be allowed to issue their own currency. But in fact, that hyperinflation happened right after the Reichsbank was privatized. And what they did was speculate against the mark. They provided margins and loans to people who were short selling the mark. And so through having these lavish loans and providing those margins, they were able to fund the betting against the mark, which made what they were betting against happen because they created all that currency. And so it resulted in people needing a wheelbarrow full of 100 million marks in order to buy a loaf of bread. So then what happened? According to a Soviet Trotskyite who was interrogated in 1938, Hitler was funded by the international bankers as a means of controlling Stalin. But then Hitler went rogue. He went rogue because when he was in the Army Intelligence Service, he was assigned to spy on the German Workers' Party. And one of the things that they were talking about was a theory by this guy, Fader. And Fader talked about creating your own currency, something that he had gotten from Lincoln in the US with the greenbacks. And so they had taken that idea of creating their own sovereign currency, and that was what Hitler did in 1933. When he came into power for 4 years, he created his own currency. They estimated that all the projects that needed to be done would cost 1 billion marks. And so they created that money and put people to work. And they ended unemployment, and they were able to extricate themselves from the financial manipulations of the international bankers. Now, what happened after they did that, and after they were so successful with that, is lost to history as far as I know. Was there a backlash from the international bankers that then created that wars of aggression? I don't know. So we need to pay attention, though, to the fact that it was international bankers who caused the drift, the despotic drift, and not actually the emergency powers that enabled them to take control over their own currency. Now I want to look at 2 things that Russell talked about. One is when he talks about the purpose of government is control. In my episode, Parenting as Anarchy, I talk about how the only legitimate use of control over someone else is to give them control over themselves. And that's where parenting and governance have that in common. So when we look at governance, what are the ways in which you can give a community control over itself? I think there are 3 measures of whether you're successful in doing that. One is home ownership, that every family needs a place to be on the earth and to call their own. And if home ownership is increasing under your governance, you are doing your job. The other is small local businesses. And then the third would be a combination of those two with small local landlords, so that people have a way of having a passive income when they retire. So let's look at how our government has done with those three things. What we know under the pandemic for both Republican and Democrat leadership is that small local businesses have been cut in half. And then home ownership is again going through a tidal wave of bankruptcies and foreclosures. And then small local landlords we could see as being a victim of things like rent moratoriums, that instead of putting people to work through the pandemic, through creating our own currency, instead what we've done is pay them to not work and to make sure that they didn't need to pay their rent, which again is going to have an impact on small local landlords, forcing them to sell and enable all of the asset grab that has been happening with things with funds like BlackRock. So finally, I want to look at something that Russell said that I think is an example of how the ideology of patriarchy has crept into our own vocabularies. He mentions in his little adorable bromance with Luke that Luke seems to be not at all hysterical, that he is calm and rational and a gentleman. Now, let's look at those terms. I'm sure that Russell knows that the word hysterical and hysterectomy have the same root. They both go back to why women couldn't be trusted to think, that they were too controlled by their emotions. And this is a belief that landed women who were thinking in insane asylums because they were too emotional. They weren't calm. They were excitable. They weren't rational. They were operating from maybe the heart, maybe intuition, and all of that was discredited. So when we look at this being a transition into a different way of thinking, I think we need to redefine masculinity, and that masculinity needs to become a different archetype than representing hierarchy and empire and competition, that we need masculinity in service to the home and the family as represented by femininity, that is the world that we need to create if we're going to get out of serving the ejaculations of men for another 100 generations. And my advice for people is that there is one of Russell's meditations where he says, sometimes when I meditate, I feel sad. And my teacher Moji has said, observe the sadness, stay with the sadness. I find myself sometimes these days just feeling stuck, feeling like, is there anything I'm doing that's worthwhile? What should I be accomplishing? Why am I not really doing anything that is working or that is making a difference? And I want to say to everyone, stay with the stuckness. Be okay with it. Observe the stuckness, but don't feel like you need to do anything about it. Right now, I'm not sure there's anything that any of us can do. We are in a waiting period where things are playing out, and there is something at work where we are the tipping point. We are at the tipping point, and all we need to do, I think, is take care of ourselves and be nice to each other. Thank you. And if you would like to see more along these same lines, here's a video that is in the same mindset. And here's a whole playlist that asks, where are the women? And I would love it if you would subscribe. Thank you.